So Jess, it's so great to be here with you today and for you agreeing to do this. It's really exciting. Our Science of Reading, What I Should Have Learned in College Facebook group is always looking for to get people to come in and do share their wonderful work. And so thank you for being here. My name's Donna Heitmanik. I am the keeper and creator of the Science of Reading, What I Should Have Learned in College, and had the pleasure of meeting Jessica last year as she interviewed me and Pam Kastner for her Glean podcasts, which was a wonderful experience. So I called on Jess today to come in and do some work with us. So I'm going to introduce Jess. Jessica Hammond has worked in education as a teacher, a curriculum designer, and teacher trainer for over 20 years, focusing on early literacy instruction, intervention, and supporting struggling readers. In 2016, she founded Glean Education, a company that provides online training for schools, districts, and states to help teachers and school leaders understand current research and implement evidence-based literacy instruction to improve student literacy outcomes, to bridge the gap between research and practice in the area of special education, language, and literacy. So without further ado, Jessica.
Thank you so much. And I'm here today with our wonderful trainer and podcast producer, Nita Charisse. So Nita, say hello.
Hi, it's so great to be here with everyone. I am looking forward to this, and I'm really excited about all of the content that we're going to cover. So welcome.
Great. And Nita is going to be working with us in the background, watching your questions and answering any thoughts you guys have in the chat. So we are here to support you guys. So just a little bit about Glean, you just heard from Donna, but we partner with schools, districts, and states to deliver online training and web-based coaching to help teachers better understand current research and implement evidence-based literacy practices to improve student literacy outcomes. You can learn more about us at gleaneducation.com or on Facebook or Twitter at Glean Education. This is our wonderful training and coaching team, of one of which Nita is part, and we are so thrilled to work with schools and districts and states across the country to support their hard work. So we'd love to hear in the chat what brings you here today. Everyone comes to these events for different reasons, sometimes personal, sometimes professional. We'd love to hear what brings you here and what your role is in education. That would kind of help orient us to where you guys are and what you're looking to do in this hour that we spend together. So our webinar has a few things that we will be focusing on. One of the first thing is understanding reading difficulties. The next is exploring 3 research-based strategies for supporting struggling readers in the classroom. And we'll also be thinking about how to apply those strategies to current practice, with a real caveat that, of course, this is just an hour. So each of these topics we could delve into for 8-hour sessions. This is very much an overview, but we're excited to start the conversation with you guys today. So the first thing we're going to do is hop right into a simulation. I really feel that it's one of the best ways to get inside the shoes of struggling readers and writers by experiencing some difficulties ourselves. So this will simulate the experience of struggling with a text-based difficulty, and it's a writing simulation, not a reading simulation, but we'll discuss kind of the power of this in a minute. So I want you guys to take a pencil in your dominant hand, and you're going to write about what you did last weekend. I'm going to give you 30 seconds to do it. It says 1 minute there because the whole exercise is a minute, but this portion will just be 30 seconds. And I'll tell you when it's time to start and when it's time to stop. Okay, so you're taking a pencil in your right hand or your left, if that's your dominant, and you're going to be writing about what you did last weekend, starting now. 30 seconds, and I'll tell you when to stop. 5 seconds left. And stop. Okay, so that certainly wasn't a lot of time. But now I'd like you guys to switch to the non-dominant hand. So the pencil moves over to your non-dominant hand, and you're going to do the same prompt. What did you do last weekend? You have 30 seconds, and I'll tell you when to stop. Start. You have 5 seconds left. Okay. So I'm really curious to hear how that went. We're going to do a quick reflection on that. I'm going to also show you how a past experience with this writing assignment went for me. So let's first get some of your reflections in the chat. How did it feel? When you were doing your non-dominant hand, did you get everything you needed to get out on paper? And what about the difference between what you were able to accomplish with your dominant hand versus your non-dominant hand? As you guys are kind of turning your attention to that, I want to point out what my experience was and highlight some things. So in this case, I wrote about what we did over Christmas break. And with my dominant hand, I wrote, over Christmas break, we stayed home. I thought it might be boring for the kids, but they enjoyed it. We watched movies, ate food, and sat by the fire. But when I switched to my non-dominant hand, it looked like this. Over break, we went nowhere. I had fun. The main thing I want to point out is, right, you can see this from your own experience in doing the simulation, is the same person. The same person did both of these. But what are our assumptions about the person that wrote the first one versus the person that wrote the second one? I can tell you both these people, in this case, have a degree, a master's degree, but we may not assume that from what we see from the second one. So let's address our assumptions and kind of be careful of what we carry in terms of assumptions when we look at students reading and writing, because a lot of times those can be a proxy for intelligence, and it can really help, it can really break down some of the work that we do when we're working with students. So struggling readers and writers, what do we know? The Yale Center for Dyslexia and Creativity says that 17% of students have difficulty learning to read on average in the classroom. So if you're lucky enough to only have 20 students, you will have about 5 students out of those 20 who will struggle with reading difficulties. And of those 5 students, 1 will have persistent reading difficulties, reading and or writing difficulties that carry through all of their academic career. In order to understand where these difficulties come from, it's really helpful to understand reading and writing acquisition when it goes well. So what happens in reading and writing acquisition in a typical reader? Well, we have a sound, for example, the sound p, and we need to pair that sound to the written symbol, which is arbitrarily picked as in English as this P, a line, and then a half circle on it. So in order to connect that sound to the symbol, we need to process the sound in our temporal lobe, which is kind of right behind your ear. So if you're listening here, just touch kind of right behind your ear right there. That's where we process that. And your occipital lobe, which is straight in the back of your head. And then we also have the complicated oral gymnastics of pronouncing the sound itself. And so we have some kind of kinesthetic movement that has to happen, and that occurs in the frontal lobe. So all these 3 things have to be connected instantaneously when we see a sound and we see its alphabetical correspondent, and we need to connect them. And for students who have deficits, like we're going to talk about, these routes are much less firm. In fact, it's more like taking the back roads rather than the highway. And we're going to talk a little bit about what research tells us about the deficits of reading difficulties and what contributes to them. So we know from research that there are really 3 core deficits that can contribute to reading difficulties and dyslexia. The first is phonological processing, and this is the ability to manipulate the sounds of language. The next is rapid automatized naming. So this is the ability to see objects and be able to name them in rapid succession. And this matters because we're really naming visual objects when we are looking at letters and connecting them to their sound correspondence. And the third deficit is orthographic working memory. Ortho means correct and graph means letter. So it's the ability to understand and remember the correct chunks of language and then regurgitate them at the proper time. So some students may have one of these deficits, but have some other compensating strengths that help them with their weaknesses. Other students may have 2, a double deficit, or 3 of these deficits, like triple deficit, that makes their difficulties even more stubborn. And we can look at writing difficulties in the same way. They've also identified through research that there are 3 core deficits that contribute to writing difficulties. The core deficit is also phonological processing, just like in dyslexia. In addition, there's auditory processing and visual processing. And when these come together, in addition to dyslexia, they create kind of a more stubborn difficulty. So you may or may not have seen this type of quadrant before to explain what these difficulties mean with regard to reading and writing. We're looking kind of at this quadrant with regard to the simple view of reading, which talks about the way in which word decoding or word recognition is related to listening comprehension to get us to reading comprehension. And it's a multiplicative relationship. So you need to have word recognition and listening comprehension in order to get reading comprehension. And when we're looking at these particular deficits, it's important to understand that not all students that have word recognition also have listening comprehension difficulties. And let's take a look. So in a typical reader, they have strong listening comprehension as well as strong word decoding skills and word recognition. And those are your readers that are at grade level or above. But when we're looking at students with dyslexia, you often have strong listening comprehension, but weak word recognition. And that's really important, especially for later on when we're trying to accommodate students who are older in the grade levels and we're trying to help them access grade level content, but the word recognition elements are still hard for them. And then we have students who the literature calls hyperlexic, students who have really strong word recognition, but weak language comprehension or listening comprehension. And a mixed reading disorder, which means these students have difficulty with word recognition as well as comprehension. And there's likely several deficits that are contributing to that. In our work today, over this hour, we're really going to be focusing on students with dyslexia, students who have weak word recognition, but strong listening comprehension. So I'd love to hear in the chat if you guys are familiar with the reading rope and Hollis Scarborough's work. Since many of you have found us through the Science of Reading Facebook page, I see Nita nodding.
Yes, we're getting lots of yeses.
Lots of yeses. So I'm sure this is not your first seminar on dyslexia, the reading rope, or the simple view of reading. We're going to look at the reading rope from this perspective in terms of helping struggling readers. So Hollis Scarborough takes a simple view of reading and says, well, it's not so simple at all. Let's see all of these important strands that contribute to this very simple view of reading. And it's important to note that word recognition is critical to build in these struggling readers from the early grades. So in our early grades, we're certainly focusing on getting them increasingly automatic in this skill set. But we really can't forget that for these students with dyslexia who have very strong language comprehension, that this is a strength for them. Language comprehension is a strength, and it's something to also continue to nurture and not forget about, even though we have an instructional emphasis on word recognition. And this matters because we want to keep them in their core ELA programs so that they're learning grade level content. They continue to build through this strength in language comprehension while working on those critical skills that they just need more support with to get automatic in word recognition. Also, for you older teachers, it's really important to keep in mind that this language comprehension piece is a way to help students access the information. So if they are students who have unfortunately not been remediated, their word recognition is still really, really difficult for them, we can help them with ways and on-ramps to their language comprehension that allows them to access grade level content. Okay, so just a few more things about what struggling readers look like and sound like, readers and writers look like and sound like, to continue building that empathy before we move into the strategies. This is a student with dyslexia in 5th grade.
Brilliant first flop. Your brilliant first flop was a rapping success. Come on, let's get busy. And on the next, she handed a notebook and Rosie Revere, who smiled at her aunt as it all became clear. Life might have its flutters, but this was not it. The true flutter can come if you quit.
So I love that piece, not to hear the child struggle, but to remind us the importance of accuracy and how quickly students can veer off path to the total opposite of what the meaning should be because of their inability to read accurately.
Brilliant.
So I'd also like to show you some samples of writing across the grade levels. So these are students who are struggling with dysgraphia, and you can see what it looks like as a student moves up. I would love to kind of hone in specifically on this one student from 6th to 8th grade to give you a sense of the mental load that these students are carrying with a typical assignment. So this student is an 8th grader. This was done at the first week of school this year. And this student was asked to write down 12 questions. 20 questions. The teacher dictated them, which is very hard for struggling writers and students with dysgraphia. And so he got to about, I'd say, question 4 before he had to stop writing the full question and then just started writing the actual important words that he's picking out. And then you can see by the end, he stops writing the questions altogether. The assignment wasn't just to write these down, but then of course he had to interview a new student in the class and ask them the responses to all these. So he couldn't write them down. He had to remember what all 20 were in order to, hide the fact that he couldn't do it. And then he had to remember all 20 to ask the student what they were. And then he actually also had to memorize what her responses were and then be able to regurgitate it to the class when they were all sharing. So think about the mental load that would take. And then think of also the incredible strengths that this child is drawing upon, because he was able to successfully complete this task without anyone knowing that there was an issue. But in truth, he had memorized 20 questions, he had memorized responses, and then regurgitated it without prompting. I would like to also point out that the paper is crumpled. So very likely he left that room, crumpled the paper, and threw it to the side, because indeed it was incredibly frustrating experience. So think about that with our students. We're going to hear something from an 8th grade student that I think will drive the idea home.
My name is Jade. I'm in the 8th grade, and reading is a huge struggle for me. Teacher would ask me to read in front of the class aloud. I'd open my mouth, but no words would come out. Not because I couldn't speak, because I couldn't read the words on the page. They were jumping around, backwards, blurry, sideways. D was a B, W was an M. I just kept it all to myself. Like, no one can relate to me. This is just my problem, and I have to deal with it. I have to find a way to deal with this. Oh my gosh. I can still remember the names. Idiot, dummy, slow, special ed. It's like every day going through that takes a piece of you. After a while, you just you get this numb feeling, like it just doesn't bother you anymore. That's when you get really worried. That's when you should get really worried. When you get this numbing feeling, someone calls you something, you're like, I don't care. They're right. That's the worst feeling in the world.
Struggling readers deal with task avoidance, non-participation, school refusal, frustration, anxiety, and depression. And when you think about that mental load that they're carrying and all that they're trying to do to kind of stay undercover, especially as they get older, this makes perfect sense. Students with dyslexia would rather be seen as unwilling than unable. So think about that when you have a student in your class that is trying to give an effect like they are appearing to be lazy. Are they really? Or are they really just avoiding the task so that they're not seen as unable? Does this bring anyone to mind? Is this, ringing any bells of students that you've worked with in the past? Feel free to pop that in the chat, saving privacy, of course, with just first names or timelines of people you knew and how they struggled. So I'd like to point out that struggling readers are just that. Struggling readers and writers deal with reading difficulty, spelling difficulty, and writing difficulty, but there's so much more than those things that are difficult for them. Oftentimes, struggling readers and writers are gifted at spatial relations, math and science, engineering and architecture, entrepreneurship. They can be incredible public speakers, storytellers, creatives, and have incredible leadership and visionary thinking, as well as sports skills. So let's think of our readers and writers as students that are a whole package and not just what they present academically. So today we're going to cover 3 research-based strategies for teaching and intervening these struggling readers. Of course, each of these could be their own training and lecture, but we thought it would be worthwhile to give overviews and kind of start the conversation in all these directions, because research does say that these 3 elements can really help support students across the grade level. We talk about using data to inform instruction. Database decision-making is a core element of high quality literacy instruction in the early years and later on as well when intervening and supporting students. We also talk about delivering explicit instruction. And so instruction and how we're delivering that instruction, what we're using to deliver it is critical. And the third element, which may be less talked about, but is critical to also talk about, is accommodations and how to design lessons aligned with universal design for learning so that all students have on-ramps to the content, even if there are barriers in their way, like the text. So as we go through these, we would love you guys to reach for a recent or future lesson plan that you're either thinking of doing, and we'll use this as a starting point to audit your practice and explore creating even more inclusive lessons. So in the chat, if you can just pop the lesson grade level and the topic in the chat, that would be great. Have any come in yet, Nita?
What did I see? Oh, just got one. Fourth grade, Meridia. Third grade, distributive property of multiplication. We have creative writing, second grade.
Okay, great.
Sure, we'll have a few more rolling in.
I'm really glad to hear about math too. A lot of these concepts work for math as well as reading and writing too, and we'll talk about the research in these areas as well. So use data to inform instruction, database decision making. Research on using data to inform instruction is very positive. In an article by Pamela Stecker, Fuchs and Fuchs on using curriculum-based measurement to improve student achievement, they reviewed research that examined this topic and found that using database decision-making was absolutely critical for students to make progress. Overall, teachers' use of curriculum-based measures produce significant gains in student achievement. And there are curriculum-based measures in both literacy and in math, of course. There are critical variables that are associated with this. For example, that the teachers are systematic in the way they use data, that they're analyzing the skills that go beyond it. So they're kind of doing a step down and saying the diagnostic. So the students may be flagged for risk, but then they go further. And another positive indicator was when the instructional recommendations for program improvements were made. So these teachers were very systematic in the way they followed the research, followed the data. And by the same researchers, they also found that curriculum-based measurement was really important in terms of progress monitoring. So not just that first thing that we do to flag for risk, but also the fact that we follow up with progress monitoring as we go and use data to inform instruction all along. The purpose of that study was to examine the importance of progress monitoring data. And they found that students for whom teachers tailored these instructional adjustments based on the progress monitoring data performed significantly better on global achievement tests than their partners whose teachers didn't use data to inform instruction. And this particular research was on both math and literacy. So again, I'm really glad you brought up the math lesson as well. I think it's a great place to start to ask how data-driven, that slide should say, how data-driven are you? Let's just walk slowly through the data spectrum. So we all know we have data deniers out there, right? They're the people that say, well, I don't believe in it. I follow my gut, and my gut is what matters. And then there are people who are data indifferent. Yes, I do. I acknowledge there's data, but it doesn't change what I do. And then there's data informed, meaning, yes, of course I use data. I benchmark 3 times a year and I send that information home to parents and I keep teaching the way I always have. And then there's where we want the bar to move for teachers, which is data driven. So we are constantly using data to assess students, to inform our instruction, and to guide our instruction all along the way. So in the chat, I would love to hear where you guys fall. How data driven are you?
Looks like we have lots of full data driven, data informed. We have a data informed, but trying to be better data driven. I appreciate that.
I appreciate
that. Is sometimes hard to admit, but that is why we're here. And I also have one that says, I live for data. I can't move forward without data. Remember, I'm a school psychologist. Yes.
Oh, good. Okay,
so that's
great. We do appreciate you, school psychologists, and your leadership role in the community in helping teachers understand why data is important and how it can play a role in their successful instruction. That's great to hear. And it sounds like many of you are on the direction that we want you to be in. So this is all in the purpose of a quality improvement cycle. And I like to remind teachers of this because oftentimes we think about quality improvement cycles in the health sphere, but it's just as relevant if we're looking at improvement in the education sphere. So we ask teachers to first set a goal and then teach toward that goal. And then, of course, reassess and progress monitor so that we know how to modify instruction. And then the whole thing starts over again. It's a series of little tests over a set couple of weeks where we say, okay, we look at the data, we think about how that affects what we're going to do with our instruction, reassess, and then modify it again. And this is all in the idea of improvement for our students. So we've developed a tool that we are hoping might help. It's always nice to walk away from these things with some sort of tool that you can potentially use tomorrow, share with your team, or use as a jumping board for discussion. This is a data-based decision-making flowchart that we've created at Glean Education for our schools and districts that we support, and we'd like to share it with you on this webinar today. Nita will be popping the link in the chat, and I'll be walking you through what this data-based decision-making flowchart is about. So you apply a universal screener to identify student risk. And it doesn't matter which screener you use. It could be AimsWeb, it could be Acadience, it could be EasyCBM, but you're going to find students that are below, well below benchmark, at benchmark, or above benchmark. From that, you're going to take step 2. And this is how we start to become more data-driven, by then using a diagnostic tool. So yes, it's important to diagnose risk, to identify risk, but we also need to diagnose the skill deficits so we know what to teach, because we're not teaching colors, we're teaching skills. So the next step is the diagnostic tool. And once that has been applied, then we ask teachers to group based on the skill, not necessarily by the level of risk. So you don't necessarily want a group of red students or orange students, because they may have very different skill deficits, and you can't treat the same skills with the same medicine, different skills with the same medicine. In this flow chart, we also have suggestions for teaching within each component skill to mastery. So if it's helpful to you, please feel free to take a look. And the beginning of this PDF group, so it has all the measures that you'll typically have on a common screener. And at the beginning, it has some ideas for data decision talks and kind of jumping off questions to start conversations with your team. So if your team is brand new to data-based decision making, this could be a great way to just bring it to a PLC session and say, you know, is there a way maybe we could start thinking about how to implement a more data-based system into our literacy instruction process? And if you're further along in it, maybe this is the tool you've been looking for to really help you make those component skill groups and try to move the bar forward for each student. Nita, were you able to drop that link in the chat? Okay, perfect.
Yes.
So when we're looking at the small group skill focuses, we usually look at the measure and then we drill down to the diagnostic, and we are going to be focusing on these early skill focuses that you're probably quite familiar with. So in kindergarten, we want to make sure that students are really sound in phonological awareness and alphabetic principle. We, in first grade, want to make sure they have all of those skills, plus building sight words, decoding, encoding, and starting to build reading fluency. And that's fluency at the sound level, the word level, the sentence level, and the passage level. And we see the same for second grade. So these are kind of the small groups that we'd like to see. In fourth and fifth grade, we're looking more toward reading fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. But it's important to remember that if students are not making progress, we need to drill down. And what we need to start thinking about is, are these reading fluency impacts or vocabulary and comprehension impacts a result of the fact that the decoding and encoding is really not firmed? And if that's the case, we need to go back no matter the age. I worked at a literacy council for adults and worked with 70-year-olds that had difficulties with decoding and encoding. And once we filled those skill deficits, they were able to comprehend again. So it doesn't matter their age, it matters the skill. So we already asked you basically how data-driven is your instruction. So this is kind of a review. But now based on seeing that, I guess I can broaden it now to your school site. You know, how data-driven is your instruction within your organization? And that really can be a different discussion, right? So if you feel able, then you can pop that in the chat as well. And maybe it's just something that if you don't feel comfortable talking about, that is just something you think about and assess so that you can help your whole school make the move toward data-driven. The next topic is delivering explicit instruction that features multiple exposures to content. In other words, practice. That's the easier way to say it. So here's some research on explicit instruction efficacy. This particular study was focused on phonics instruction and the impact of teaching regularities in the writing system explicitly rather than relying on discovery. Interestingly, this particular research study focused on 48 adults that were split into two groups, and they were learning a writing system that was completely new and arbitrary. So it wasn't a new language, but it was one that none of these people had seen. They split them up into two groups, explicit instruction and discovery method. And the results were pretty astounding. 100% of the adults in group 1 achieved mastery from explicit instruction of the sound and symbol correspondences. And only 25% of students in group 2 achieved mastery from the discovery method. So these findings illustrate the dramatic impact of teaching method on outcomes during reading acquisition, and specifically explicit instruction. There's also another research study that I wanted to show you that focuses on explicit instruction versus guided reading in fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. And this was a research study in 2014 by Caroline Denton, Jack Fletcher, and others, including Dr. Sharon Vaughn, and it was a really interesting comparison study. The purpose of this study was to evaluate the effects of explicit instruction, EX, and guided reading for students with reading difficulties. So they actually split these students into 3 randomly assigned groups. Group 1 was an explicit instruction group. Group 2 was a guided reading group. And group 3 was like business as usual, the typical instruction that was happening in a school. It's important to note that both groups made gains over typical reading instruction. So having a formalized reading program and students who are meeting every day and doing the work with a trained staff member is better than nothing at all. But overall, the students who were learning by way of explicit instruction versus guided reading instruction had significant gains in phonological decoding, but specifically high in fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. So the gains were 2 times the effect, 3 times the effect, and in certain measures of comprehension, up to 4 times the effect, which is pretty impressive. An analysis of the added value of providing the interventions and relative growth showed that explicit instruction is more likely to substantially accelerate student progress in phonemic decoding, text reading fluency, and comprehension. And I mean, think about the lifespan of a student that we are working with to try to remediate their difficulties. The fact that something could accelerate it 4 times as fast is really critical to their development. We are going to listen to a wonderful explanation of explicit instruction for about 4 minutes by the wonderful Anita Archer as a reminder of the importance of this and how it plays a critical role in literacy instruction.
So I have the gift today of talking to you about explicit instruction. Explicit instruction simply is instruction that is quite direct, it is unambiguous, with the goal that the students would get it, would understand it, and would learn. We have a lot of confusion around the term explicit instruction, so let me sort of augment and add to that. One question I'm often asked is, wouldn't it be more motivating for students to learn it on their own, to discover it, to use authentic problems to discover it? And it's as if we have set up a total dichotomy between explicit instruction and discovery, but we really should view it as a continuum. And when we look at the research on instruction, we learn what are the attributes of that continuum. For example, if you are teaching children that are novices, that have just never learned this body of knowledge in the past, it appears that they do much better if we explicitly teach them the information, whether it's knowledge or skills or strategies, that we teach it. If they are learning a body of knowledge that they've not learned in the past, they're brand new to algebra, they are new to decoding of words, then they really benefit from very explicit instruction. So those two things, when the student is a novice, when the knowledge is new, explicit instruction would be desirable. But then after you've gained lots of information, you've gained lots of skills, then discovery is much more a viable option, but only after you've had explicit instruction. So one of the things that I also would be reminded of is the research. If you happen to be a special ed teacher, an interventionist, and you are working with struggling students, we definitely know that they are going to gain more with very explicit instruction than discovery. You know, if they had discovered it, they would not have been struggling. And so we need to have very explicit instruction for them. And what would that mean? Well, we could actually take explicit instruction and put it into two areas. One is the design of the instruction, and the other is the delivery of the instruction. And the design of the instruction means that we pick important content to teach them, we break it down into obtainable pieces, but then our lessons are organized so that more learning could occur. For example, I often talk about 3 major steps in teaching children skills and strategies, where I do demonstration, guided practice, checking for understanding. I do it, we do it, you do it. And many of the skills and strategies we teach would follow that pedagogy. But it also means that the students are not only directly taught it, but they have practice. And actually, I'm going to tell you, my concern is often that we're not giving adequate practice. I have constantly hear people say, well, you know, Anita, that is just drill and kill, drill and kill. And I can tell you, we have no reported incidents of children dying of practice. Instead, look at the research, the abundant research from cognitive science and from learning on practice. The students need deliberate practice where they're practicing with a purpose. They need practice that is spaced over time, not all in one session. And they need to retrieve information in that practice. So it's a combination of very explicit instruction with I do it, we do it, you do it, followed with deliberate and spaced practice and retrieval. But
All right. So many wonderful lessons that we can learn from Anita Archer, and a reminder to explore more of her work too, because she really has the most to say on this topic and can be really powerful to your instruction. She explains in her book on explicit instruction that explicit instruction is powerful because it's systematic, it's relentless, it's engaging, it's successful. She gives us actually a framework, like she just talked about, the I do it, you do it, I do it, we do it, you do it, so that the gradual release of control. But there's also a system for systematic explicit instruction in terms of how we structure our lesson plans that can be potentially helpful to your lessons as you're planning it if you don't already have these pieces. So she talks about 3 important parts: the opening, the body, and the closing. And review and preview of the information is part of all these elements. So for the opening of a lesson, it usually includes several activities that frame the purpose, tell the students the why you're doing what you're doing, include them in the engagement of it, and ensure students have the prerequisite skills. So you're reviewing maybe something that you've touched upon before, and feel confident to engage with the new skill now. So you're not starting anyone in the middle of the show, for example. You are going to remind them where they came from, bolster their ideas with the review and practice, and then preview the skills that are coming. The body of the lesson is where the new skills occur. And then the closing of the lesson is where we review what they just learned and, of course, preview the next one. So students are brought along. They're handheld throughout the way. They're explained why they're doing it, and they're included in the background information. This reminds me, sometimes I'll be driving in with my younger kids in the car, and they'll be like, "Where are we going now?" And I'll be like, "Oh, that's right. I didn't even tell you. We're going to the park." Well, they probably would have liked to know that, right? So let's remember to bring our students along. They're here for the journey. It's actually their learning journey. And explicit instruction is one way we can do this. Anita Archer talked about distributed and cumulative practice and intentionality. And the reason why this is important, especially for our struggling readers, is that students need multiple exposures. You may be lucky and have those students that need one exposure to a specific topic, others 3 to 5. But our students who struggle with reading and writing difficulties can take up to 30, sometimes 50, depending on their deficit. So it's just a way to kind of level the playing field if we enable our lessons to kind of be smattered with practice throughout, and all students, no matter those who just needed one exposure or 50, have equal access to this practice. To point out and kind of make the argument even more, if you've heard of John Hattie and his work and his meta-analysis of looking at all of the research that is around effective instruction and effective techniques, his meta-analysis showed that direct and explicit instruction comes in the zone of desired effects at around 0.94. And that is incredibly effective work. It's some of the most effective work that is in research today. So it's worth investing in. I would love to show you just a quick snippet of Anita Archer at work. And you can see how this practice is actuated.
Some of them we're going to go over the meanings because they're in our part. And the first word here is what, everyone? Allude. Don't write anything down, pencils down, and read the definition and go. If you allude someone, you avoid them or escape from them. So if you allude someone, you avoid them or escape from them. Read the first example sentence and go. The runaway slaves eluded the patrol who were hunting them. Okay, and so they might hide somewhere, go into a barn, go into the woods, go in the back.
So throughout this really interesting video, which Nita can pop the link in the chat to the video so you guys can peruse it yourself because it's quite long. Throughout this, you'll see that she offers so many opportunities for practice that take the form of different exercises, either partner practicing, regurgitation, so they're responding to her, practicing individually, and there's all sorts of ways to conceive of the practice. There's a rubric that we wanted to share with you to help you consider how effective your explicit and systematic instruction is. And if you happen to be an administrator on the call, this is a great way to assess whether your teachers are providing explicit instruction. And Nita can also pop this tool in the chat. This is from Building RTI at UTexas, which is a wonderful resource for RTI supports. Thanks, Nita. So on a scale from 0 to 10, how explicit is your instruction? When you're looking at that lesson plan, maybe that you pulled up, how many opportunities for practice are there? And are there any opportunities maybe you could build in that you haven't built before?
Okay, we have someone who says is very explicit, but they could work on more review and adding lots of practice, which is a common thing for teachers. Also, another participant says use of an alternative pencil for struggling writers. So providing those accommodations. And sure have. Explicit, but not much time to add in for practice.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. And I love that someone mentioned the accommodations for struggling writers. Was that it? Use of alternatives?
Yes.
Because that's where we're headed right now with design lessons with universal design for learning. So it's a perfect way to queue up our next and last topic that we're going to cover today. Universal design for learning is a specific concept, and please throw in the chat if you're familiar with it. I'd love to hear whether people, this is a review or brand new, to help me frame how I explain it. But this is a system for instructional design that was created and kind of bolstered by the company CAST. And the idea of it is to provide as many on-ramps to content and reduce as many barriers as possible. And research findings have been very, very favorable that suggest that UDL-based practices hold incredible promise for diverse students in grades pre-K through 12. Qualitative data from a number of studies indicated that teachers and students were also more engaged and motivated by UDL practices. And we all know if our students are more engaged, then they can be more in touch with the content, and thus outcomes are better. We don't have a whole lot of time, so I'm going to skip over this UDL at a glance. But Nita, if you would so kindly pop that CAST
Yes.
link in the chat, perfect. Then you guys can head over to CAST and do some exploring yourself if you're not already familiar with it. It's a wonderful resource to help you make your align your practice with universal design for learning. One of the key concepts of UDL is removing barriers. And when we think about, it's kind of something akin to on-ramps, right? Ramps as opposed to stairs enables many more people to access it. So when we think of our content, we want to think about all the learners and, keep an eye on those deficits that we talked about earlier and how hard students have to work, and how can we create on-ramps to reduce the barriers that are present in your particular lessons, some of which you're really not even aware of, because if you don't have those barriers yourself, you may not be attuned to what students need. So thinking holistically about this can help us create more inclusive lessons. So here's an example of a traditional lesson plan that is not aligned with UDL. Nita, would you want to work through this with us? Okay, I'll give my voice a break and let you read through it.
No problem. Okay, so the traditional plan, goals. Students read about Hurricane Ida and write a 10-sentence summary on the subject. The materials, a textbook and a PDF of article. The methods. Students partner read the article together, then annotate the article, then write their summary using examples from the text and share with the class. Assessment. Teacher grades the article on number of sentences. If less than 10 sentences, a point is deducted from the 10 possible points.
Okay, so yeah, go ahead, sorry.
No, go ahead.
So from what you know about, let's take that student who was struggling with the 20 questions example, just think about some of the barriers that might present itself to that student. All of the goals are about reading or writing, and there don't seem to be any elements of listening or viewing that might help with their strengths, which are visual and auditory. And the materials are all textbooks or PDFs that can't be read out loud. Students read the article together and then annotate and then write the summary. And then they're deducted for any writing or reading performance. So I'm just going to play this quick audio that is first in the chat. While I'm reading through that, identify some barriers, and you can pop those in the chat. But I'd also love to play this audio from one of the previous directors at CAST about the importance of creating these elements aligned with UDL.
In thinking about beginning to apply the UDL principles to classroom practice, we often find that it is best to think about lessons that are not effective for all learners, and then to pause and reflect about what are the potential barriers in the lessons that will prevent all learners from achieving success. And we look at barriers in the goals, barriers in the materials, barriers in the methods, and barriers in the assessment. Once we can identify the barriers and think about the way that one could design goals, methods, materials, and assessment that align to the UDL principles, then we can move forward in designing a lesson for all learners.
And now for the counterpoint, this is a lesson aligned with UDL. So Anita, if you want to read through this.
Yes. Goals. Students will learn about Hurricane Ida's effect and apply their understanding of the topic through a written summary, narrative, presentation, or project. Materials. A Newsella article enabled with a text-to-speech and a CNN 10 video. The methods. After students read or listen to the article and view the video to explore what happened, then explore the topic in 3 small group rotations. Station 1, meet with the teacher to discuss the why it matters and explore questions related to the topic. Station 2, a center activity. Students work with 1 or 2 other students and to explore a model of how the event occurred and the impacts to the infrastructure. Station 3, another center activity. Students work individually to create a response to what they learned, either through a written, narrative, oral presentation, audio collage, artistic representation, or alternative approved by the teacher. In the assessment, teacher provides feedback on the individual responses with time provided to make updates in the next class session before submission.
So think about what the potential on-ramps were. What are the things in that? And I can go back so you guys can look at that lesson plan. What are the things that may have given more students opportunity that weren't present in the first one?
Okay. The video, the article, and the opportunity to actually discuss.
Mm-hmm. Great. Discussion is so powerful.
Video. Yeah. Oh, and also this is a good one. Multiple choices of the final product. So no one work product.
Mm-hmm. So true. So individual choice and allowing students to access the content from their own direction. Those on-ramps are incredibly powerful for students to highlight their strengths as opposed to fitting, their weaknesses into what's expected. I'll leave you with a final quote. If a student is not learning, it's because we have not yet found the strategy to make it happen. So I know that your students are lucky to have you all. After a long work day, you come and spend an hour with us to keep learning and trying to make yourself better for your students. And I just thank you for the time that you've spent with us.